Thank you, as always, for coming in for one more of our public series. Today we have with us Ian Cook, who's from the Central European University at Budapest, and he's visiting IIHS as part of the Urban Knowledge Network Asia program. And I'll hand it over to Ian to take it forward from here.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming, and thanks a lot for IIHS for hosting me. I've been here about a month, and I've been to some really interesting publics, and I learned a lot. And yeah, hopefully what I say today will be interest of some people here. So I'll start. Once every now and again, Nitesh is forced to break his routine, and one such occasion was the third time that I met him. He'd agreed to let me walk the streets with him as he sold flowers for the second time in a week. Carrying the flowers in a basket on his head, he travelled a similar, yet changing route for 10 years. Taking 4 hours and done mostly on foot, Nitesh's route winds down from the bus station into the heart of the market district, round tight streets lined with old red brick bungalows, expanses surrounded by new multi-storey apartments, and wide, busy market streets, nestled in between wholesalers and retailers. The evening before the third time that I met him, he drunkenly crashed a friend's motorbike and could no longer walk. He decided to travel back to his home village, some 7 hours bus ride away, whilst he recovered. However, he did not want to damage his carefully cultivated reputation for regularity amongst his customers. And so, with this in mind, he found a stand-in in Devaraj, a fresh off-the-bus villager who was to try his hand at selling flowers in Mangalore for the very first time. He knows the route, he told Devaraj, pointing at me as he hobbled off towards the bus. He'll show you. And thus Devaraj and I set off around 6 a.m. to try and retrace the steps of Nitesh. Needless to say, I was a complete failure as a guide. I'd only done this walk twice before, and many of the houses and businesses I could remember refused Devaraj at first, telling him we only buy from one particular guy. I apologised, I bought Devaraj a beer, and hoped that the 30% or so of the route that I was able to remember would be enough to make Devaraj's trip to Mangaluru worthwhile. So today I'm going to talk to you about flower sellers of Mangaluru. Now, as of course all you all know, lots of selling in India is done in the street by moving vendors who move around. So I was doing research for around 18 months in Mangalore around 2.5 years ago, and I did research with lots of different types of moving vendors. I did research with magazine subscription sellers, with tender coconut sellers, with astrologists, with flower sellers, and so on. And I was very interested to try and find out the ways in which their sort of everyday routines in their everyday lives feeded into the larger changes which were taking place in the city. Now, sort of a very simple thing as a guiding thing that I realized very early on, and maybe quite obvious, but wasn't obvious to me at first, was that for the moving vendors who had a set route, more important than the quality of the goods they were selling, and more important than the sort of patter or discussions that they had with the customers, was the regularity which they had to keep. That people expected them to be at a certain place at a certain time each day. This was the key for them and their sort of crucial market advantage, if you like, to be able to sell. Now, doing the same thing at the same time each day doesn't imply some sort of mechanical repetition. Rather, it's what I call a rhythmic engagement laced with intention, relying on certain amounts of attention by these sellers, and it's also a work of cultivation within a changing and yet patterned city. So I'm going to start this paper in a minute by making 3 very broad claims about contemporary Indian cities, especially a smaller city like Mangaluru. And then I'm going to switch between 2 different styles of presentation. First, I'm going to give you a very detailed account of one flower seller's life. I'm going to call this guy Nitesh, it's not his real name. And this is going to be the more ethnographic part of the research. And secondly, I'm going to try and draw on this and abstract from the things that I learned from the flower sellers by discussing 3 different things. One, the nature of the Indian street. Secondly, something about learning and how we do learning. And finally, something about anticipation and about expectation and what this can possibly teach us about the Indian city. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time discussing one particular flower seller who I'm calling Nitesh. And not because he's an exceptional case or because the other flower sellers aren't interesting, but rather, I think, if you examine one person's life in a lot of detail, then we can not only learn about the wider processes or structures within which they operate, but we can also see the unexpected, the unplanned, and the often unnoticed things which might be lost in a more abstract or top-down view. So in this paper, I'm going to structure Niteche's life around 3 or 4 different temporal frames. Once every now and again, once in a while, once a week, once a day, once or thrice a year, and once a year. Now, I think such experimental temporal frames for this presentation or for this paper gives a more dynamic and fluid account of city life, something which is closer to how we actually live life rather than trying to present it in a fixed or static way. And after this paper, the floor will be open for discussion, and I hope like lots of you have ideas or want to tell me what doesn't work in the paper, etc., and so on. I guess many of us come from different backgrounds. This way. So I'm sure you all know where Mangalore is, so usually I'd put a proper map of Mangalore, but this is rather just my favorite map of Mangalore from 1962, because it shows somehow how even though Mangalore is a small city, or a smaller city as I'd rather call it, because it's a relational thing, it's nevertheless a very well-connected city. You see the boat goes all the way to Aden, Colombo, and then up to Mumbai and Pakistan. And Mangalore has long been a very well-connected city. It's been known in the Middle East way back, even in ancient Greece, Mangalore is on maps. And of course it also has an international airport and a national highway and train and so on. But yeah, but there's more important things about Mangalore, and I'll come to those in a few minutes. First, I want to give you, I'm going to have to learn which way this goes, eh? First, I'm going to tell you a little bit these 3 sort of broad claims that I want to make. First is, I'm going to, what I call expectant urbanism. Now, we all know the sort of rhetoric which is going around, which has been going around sort of the Indian public sphere in the last sort of 20 years or so, and I think it's really quite intense now. You know, India is inbound, India is shining, it's arrived to the global stage, and the city is very key in this. I mean, many of you maybe know this report by the consultancy firm McKinsey, which said, you know, India is having an urban awakening, and of course we can't open a newspaper without reading something about smart cities. You know, there's a lot of excitement about what the urban future is going to be and like how it's going to be, etc., and so on. There's a real great amount of expectation, and I think a smaller city like Mangaluru feels this expectation in a different way, maybe even in a stronger way. There's a lot of feeling in Mangalore that, you know, they're going to be the next mini, they're going to be a mini Bangalore, or even better, a mini Singapore, you know, and there's a lot of booming real estate that's going on. There's a fledgling IT and BPO sector. There's lots of education institutes which have a long history in the district, but now lots of private colleges are coming up. And there's a real feeling that, you know, that something is happening, that something is just around the corner. Now, I, like maybe many of you, are very highly skeptical of claims whenever they're made, not just in the Indian context, but anywhere, that say things are going to be wonderful and better in the future. But I think we can't dismiss these things as like neoliberal propaganda or state propaganda and so on. Rather, we have to understand the ways in which these sorts of myth-makings play out in the lives of urban dwellers. And we have to understand the power of expectancy, you know, the power of expectant urbanism, what that does to people's lives. And yeah, so I think if I wanted to abstract from this and abstract from the Mangalore case, I would say there's 3 sort of broad ways in which, you know, the city is imagined in the future. One of this is a way of being a place of smooth flow with like wide roads where things move very easily. Another way is the city as a place of accelerated progress. It's through cities which like development can happen. This people really believe. And the third thing is like a sort of friction-free consumption, away from the messiness of like the market, your interaction with your vendors and so on, and rather this sort of, you know, nice, even online sort of consumption. This is somehow how the city of the future, I feel, is imagined in Mangalore. Third time lucky? Okay, so I think expectancy does something very important. I think it creates both order and disorder. Now, the first thing to say about this is I think the flowing, accelerating, friction-free city of the future is predicated upon the labor of others. And this is often forgotten, you know? So like those people such as housing and land brokers or street hawkers or auto rickshaw drivers, these are the people who, along with their family, they're often framed as being from like the old India or the informal or the backwards. And yet it's their labor to a certain degree that allows the imagination of this sort of free-flowing, friction-free city to take place, you know? It's the auto driver who's taking the middle-class kids to school. It's the hawker who's coming inside the residential enclave to deliver fresh fish in the morning, as often is the case in Mangalore. And so this is a real sort of ironic twist on it, and especially because a lot of people from these groups, hawkers and auto drivers and so on, they also believe in the myth, and they also expend a lot of energy in ordering their life in the present, in the idea that the future is really going to be something great. So you have hawkers spending quite a lot of their quite small income on sending their kids to private education back in their home villages and so on. So this is one of the reasons why we really have to try and understand the power of this myth. And the second thing, to say about this is not only to do with an ordering from below, but it's also a large amount of disorder. And this disorder isn't necessarily to be found amongst hawkers or rickshaw drivers or brokers, but rather it's a disorder from above. And this is what Roy has argued for the last 5 years or so. Like this idea that we have to rush, we really have to catch up. This allows a sort of state of exception to happen, like to allow sort of there to be a lack of regulation. We have to have things happen, we have to take land, we have to ignore any building code violations, etc. and so on, because we really need to rush, we really need to catch up, we really need to be part of this. Now, so as such, if you look at people like hawkers, they're both in and out of step with this sort of city's dominant beat. They're both very important to the maintenance of this sort of myth which is building of expectancy, and yet at the same time they're constantly framed as backwards. Okay, so how to understand expectant urbanism? What's the way, how can we think about it? How can we conceptualize this? Now I believe, and I'm going to talk a lot about this in a more ethnographic way, but to say some sort of broad points to begin with, I think the answer lies in rhythm. Now you think about a city, one way to think about a city is it's made up of lots of different people, of lots of different traffic, animals, weather, whatever you want to think is contained in a city. And these things are all moving. These things all have a certain pattern. They all have a certain rhythm. And then you can think of the various ways in which people are in and out of rhythm or in and out of time with one another. So you can think of the city as an agglomeration or an aggregation of heterogeneous different rhythmic modes or patterns. Now, they're constantly moving between being in synchrony or asynchrony, to being in time with each other or not being in time with each other. Between when things are happening correctly, there's a certain amount of coherence that we can understand in the city. And sometimes the city can seem completely incoherent. Sometimes there's people and groups that move with a certain common direction, and often they're moving in very disparate directions. And I think as you start to think about rhythm, you start to think of this interplay between moving between something being in time or out of time. And I'm talking a bit about time, or rather to talk about rhythm, because I think in understanding the city, we really need to think a little bit less, or move beyond, or create a new sort of dialogue away from space, or even worse, spatiality, which is even more abstract. Because I think thinking too often in space, I mean space, of course, thinking through the city in space can be very useful, but we'll start to think about maps, we start to think about plans, we start to think about architects and planners, the sorts of people who are in this institution, who do very exciting, of course, and interesting work. But what this can do is it can somehow stay at a level of abstraction which misses people's everyday life, which misses the sort of messiness of everyday urban existence, which really makes up a lot of people's lives. Now, I don't think that, even though there's some very dynamic conceptions of space, still I think there's a tendency in social sciences and elsewhere to depict things of happening in space, or even also in time, and as if they were containers within which people live their lives. But if you start thinking of the city as a collection of rhythms, then you're not only, you stop thinking of the city, the village, or the Muslim part of the city, or the poor part of the city, but rather you started to think of the city as being made up of people who move and what their movements create. So everything moves, and everything changes. And this isn't to say that there's no structure or that there's no pattern. It's rather just to say that change and sameness are linked, The structure of the city is known through its movements. We know when we're in a certain part of a city, not just by looking at a map, but we can feel a certain part of a city, and we can feel a certain part of a city at a certain time of day. If a city becomes static, still, it ceases being a city, at least experientially. So when all these movements are gestured and repeated in a sequence, they become knowable, they become learnable by others. And they can also be conducted and moved in certain ways. They have a rhythm. So people like Nitesh, who I'm going to talk about a lot today, as they move through the city as part of their everyday life, they act on and with predictabilities as well as chance. Of course, his life is mediated by things like his jati, his gender, his age, and his religious community, and so on. But it's also about It's also very much to do with him trying to turn regularities from being sort of the grinding, binding, mundane actions into something which is comfortable, reliable, and dependable. And it's also about finding things which are irregular, from being disorderly or confusing, into something which is exciting and galvanizing, something which has potential. And so, as such, and with India's expectant urbanism in mind, I think vendors not only have to pragmatically pay attention to all the different movements of the city, but they also have to choose very carefully when to act, not only to act with intent, but also to materially advance in their lives, but also they have to cultivate certain images of themselves with people that they come into contact with, or even people who just observe their movements. And I move on with this in mind. Once in a while, Nitesh heads back to his home village. The bus ride takes 7 hours and stretches its way over the hills that hem Mangaluru up against the sea before dropping down into the plateau. The roads become gradually straighter and faster as the bus approaches Mysuru. Nitesh sees nothing of this as he's fast asleep in a comfortable bed on a luxury bus. He doesn't have a ticket for the bus, but rather an agreement with the conductor, who makes money on the side by transporting flowers from Mysuru to Mangaluru and flower sellers back the other direction. Nitesh gets off at a small village around 45 minutes from the city and makes his way through the dark to his wife and daughter. The village, which I'm not going to give the name of, lies along the south side of the road and has a few thousand inhabitants. Though its name was given by a water body, it no longer has much agricultural production, beyond those who do some subsistence farming. As Nitesh likes to constantly remind me, if there's no rain, there's no work. Nitesh, like many from the village, is from the Nayaka Jati. Nayaka, as of course you all know, can be loosely translated as leader, and of course there are many Jatis with Nayaka or some derivative in India. And now Nitesh and the other Nayakas in this village, they trace their ancestry to the Nayakas of Chitradurga, who ruled the eastern part of Karnataka from around the 1500s to 1799. And over time, they also refer to themselves as scheduled caste, or rather SC, and sometimes they'll even call themselves ST, which was always confusing for me and created lots of confusion amongst themselves. And they are considered untouchable by some caste Hindus, and a local Dalit activist, he told me that they are, or maybe rather that they were, leather workers by Jati trade. However, nowadays, nearly everyone in the village from their caste sells flowers. Now, the village's position really lends itself to flower selling. It's not only close to the large flower seller in Mysuru, but it's also on the side of the road that leads to Mangalore. And so accordingly, flowers can be sent through a relative in the flower market, they can be collected in the village, they can be woven into garlands by the female family members, and then the following morning, they can be sent on buses, not only to Mangalore, but to different towns across Karnataka. Now, these Nayaka flower sellers from the village, they can be found in many different urban centres across the state, Madikeri, Mangaluru, and so on. And many of them shift locations, especially when they first start doing the work, until they find a city which is best for them. Now, they work as both moving and as stationary vendors, like sitting in one place and also moving around the city. And even though they move around sometimes in groups, all their businesses are individual. Now, something very important I think we have to address before moving on about the flower sellers is the place of work, which is the street. Now, there's been a lot of research, well, not a lot, there's been some research done into hawkers and vendors in India, more of the sort of survey style. And like there's research into 10 different Indian cities made by the National Association of Street Vendors of India. And they found that for the most part, vendors are from OBC or SC castes, that they're married, that they're male, that they're rather stationary rather than moving around, that they're self-financed, and they work between 8 and 12 hours a day, excluding any needed preparation time, and they usually live in cramped housing. And their customers come from a wide range of different income brackets, and people often say they like going to hawkers because they're convenient, because they're fresh, and because they're cheaper. But at the same time, many of these same people complain the vendors cause congestion, or that they charge richer looking customers more, try being a white person, or that they sometimes complain about the quality of goods. Now, there was also some survey research done in Mangalore in 2009, and they covered about nearly 1,000 different vendors in the city, and they found that 94% of them were self-employed, and in terms of education, about 25% were illiterate, 50% had primary education, 22% secondary education, 25% PUC, and finally like 0.8% were graduates. Now, most of them didn't actually own the stores that they used, rather they rented their stores from somebody else. But I think we need to add to this survey data by looking at the ways that the vendors are positioned in the street. in more discursive and material ways. Now, very often, vendors are described as being anti-modern, as being the sort of thing which are, especially often by middle classes in the city, of being groups who don't quite fit into this modern narrative of what the city should be. Modern streets, as I said before, they should be ordered, they should be flowing, they shouldn't be clogged with people on the pavements. This is often how they're framed. And I have a quote here by some research done in Delhi by Rajagopal. He says, given the ability of hawkers to weave through the heterogeneous zones of the city without necessarily having the right to reside in them, in a time of unchecked urban growth, they become a symbol of metropolitan space gone out of control. And we have to keep this in mind, but we also have to see not only are they framed as being anti-modern by certain groups, they also, of course, face police harassment. I won't say too much on this. I won't say too much on this because it's pretty obvious, but many hawkers have to pay hafta to policemen as part of their sort of everyday existence in the city. Now they also face, of course, evictions and like demolitions of their stand. But some very interesting research was done by Anjaria in Mumbai amongst stationary street hawkers, and he found that these regular everyday payments of hafta to low-level policemen, this also opened up what he calls a space of ordinary negotiation, because when the local municipality decided to demolish all the stands, the policemen knew about it a day or 2 days in advance, and they would go and tell the hawkers, hey, guys, watch out, you're going to get all your stuff demolished tomorrow, so they can move and they could hide their goods. So we can't, of course, paying hafta is bad, but it also changes certain relations in the city at the same time. Now, hawkers have been very organized. In Mangalore, they're organized, and also nationally in this National Association of Street Vendors of India. They were pushing very hard for this, the creation of the Street Vendors Act, which came in 2014. And my research just about stopped as this came into being, so I won't talk too much about that. I think it's still a little bit too early to say about what this will happen. But even the idea of it happening was already changing things in Mangalore. And so the local city corporation, they were already basically stopping the demolitions with the idea in mind that that this new law was going to come into place. And in Mangalore, with the help of the National Association of Street Vendors of India, there was a successful struggle by female headloaders who came from villages around the city to basically gain formal recognition outside the market, and they paid a rent and they had paperwork for that rent, and they could sit then in front of the market in the city. And the last thing to say about this is again about sort of class-based claims in the city. Now, again, like there's this idea that's, especially amongst sort of the upwardly vocal and very confident middle-class groups in the city, that certain parts of the city shouldn't have vendors or hawkers in them, especially their parts of the city. And this, again, is a little bit obvious thing to say, but some really interesting research done in Delhi where the researcher, whose name did I write down? Schneidler or something, some German guy, he found out that actually they did want the hawkers in their part of the city, but they only wanted a certain amount of them and at a certain time of day. So basically they negotiated with them sort of terms of use. Okay, you can come into our residential enclave, or you can sit outside and we won't call the police, etc. and so on, but you should only be here in the morning, in the evening, and you shouldn't be here like over the weekend, and there shouldn't be more than 2 of you, and so on. Around once a week, the flower sellers that sit selling near the bus station are scolded by the police. In the morning, the sellers walk the streets of the city, delivering their flowers door to door, leaving only 2 or 3 stationary flower vendors near the bus station. In the evening, however, there is no walking work, and most of the flower sellers, even the ones who walk around during the day, sit in a row and sell. The busy junction near where they sit is the site of regular minor traffic accidents. It's a really stupidly made road. And even though they're not selling in an officially sanctioned spot, the police do usually allow the flower vendors to sell as long as they stay within like a sort of a waist-high depression, which is back from the road. And the idea behind this is that they don't block the way for walkers coming past. And the flower sellers do not actually inhibit any walkers in their position, but they do like to be close to the road so that they can be seen and they can be reached by passers-by. I mean, often when people are buying the garlands of flowers, they don't even get off their motorbike or out of their car, they just want it passed in and out of the window. Now, every now and again, when there's an accident, and then suddenly there's lots more police on the scene. And on these days, the policemen force then the sellers back off the pavement and push them back down into the channel by the side of the road. And then, as time passes and slowly the flower sellers start to creep forward until again they get scolded and go back. Now, I'm going to talk in the next section a lot more about walking and being on the move, because walking or being on the move as a seller allows people like Nitesh to avoid police fines or police harassment, and it can also offer higher profits than those who stay still. And this was like the probably most amazing thing to understand that I found during the research, was that learning a set route took an amazing amount of skill, an amazing amount of time, an amazing amount of coordination of all the different contingencies and all the different possibilities. And so these routes are developed and they're learned sometimes over a decade. And you know, as I used to sit at home and I tried to write all the routes myself, or I tried to work out all the different things, I basically always failed. I realized this wasn't something that necessarily can be drawn on a piece of paper, but it's something that has to be understood and learned from walking. Now, walking is a really interesting thing to think about, because walking does something quite interesting, I think. I mean, walking is something which, of course, is very structured, which has a lot of rules about it, certain contours, places we should walk, places we shouldn't walk, and so on. But at the same time, walking is always open to something different happening. You know, like, it's always, you know, you always have to be aware of the contours of the street and the certain strategies that try to circumscribe it. But always we're aware of the sort of availabilities or possibilities to transgress certain rules. Now, both to be aware of, I don't know, potholes, but also to be aware of police, etc., and so on. Now, the body is really interesting in this. If you think about the way we walk and how we walk and the way different people walk, we walk in a certain way, and this is something which has been trained. This isn't something that we have from when we're born. We learn to walk in a different way in different situations, and we act in a certain way. And you can even think about this in how people train animals like horses or dogs. The way that, you know, society or culture also trains us as men or as women or as old people or as young people or as hawkers or as, like, you know, morning people out on their health walk in their saris and trainers. Like, everyone walks in a different way, and you can identify people not only necessarily by their clothes or by their face, but you can also identify them from their gait, from the way that they're walking. And in this way, I think, like, that walking also is inseparable from its surroundings. You know, as you walk a certain place or a certain street, you sort of imbue certain attributes from the environment around you. So with this in mind, like that these flower sellers are walking, we have to think about how they learn the city walking. Now, I think learning has three different aspects, or at least for these flower sellers, walking to learn had three different aspects. The first one was coordination. For example, if you think about your own lives, you know, we have to coordinate, you know, many different things. So these flower sellers have to coordinate their different rhythmic modes of their wares, like, so the lifespan of the flowers, the delivery schedules that they had to do both to receive them and to deliver them. And also they had to think about the different rhythmic patterns of their customers, you know, what time they needed their puja in the morning, and they also have domestic schedules. These customers also have work schedules. They also have to think about the different rhythmic modes of types of transport. For instance, you can get on a bus with flowers very early in the morning because there's no rush, but you can't get on a bus later in the morning because you won't be able to carry the flowers because they'll all be crushed, all these things and so on. Now, I think coordination involves using what we can call, in an abstract way, mediating structures. Here I'm following Colin McFarlane and Hutchins. And these are just very simple things that we use to try and overcome complexity. Something as simple as a bus timetable or a watch. But aside from these more sort of, you know, abstract ideas of timetables and watches and so on, like, we also learn, we also pass on things that we learn from one person to another. So you don't just learn something and then that's it, but rather in the very act of learning, you're translating this knowledge. So for instance, if I'm a flower seller and I learn one route from somebody else, then I start to do it myself. Already in this, even in the process of learning, I've already started to translate that knowledge based on my own previous experience, etc., and so on, and start to change something. So learning is never static, it's always dynamic, and it's always changing. So, and again, like with walking in mind, I think with the learning, you also have to account for the sort of the unforeseeable or the uncontrollable aspects of learning. And this is something that I'm going to call submersion. You know, like, vendors have to submerge themselves into the rhythmic patterns of the city. They have to submit themselves to where the city pulls them. They have to walk the same routes at the same time each day. But if someone calls them here or calls them there, then they have to be ready for that. They have to be ready to go. Now, this sort of repetitive submersion is not something which is mechanical or uncreative or unimaginative and so on. It can actually be an extremely creative act. If you think about learning in another setting, like an Indian classical art setting, it's all about repetition. You know, it's all about copy, repeat, copy, repeat, copy, repeat to learn. So just repetition isn't necessarily limiting or uncreative. And finally, I'm going to turn to this more in the last section. Throughout all of these different types of learning as they're walking around the city, flower sellers have to be aware of what customers come to think of them. Not least in the construction of maintenance of their renown for being regular. They have to be known as someone who delivers goods at a certain time. So I'm going to return to this later, but for now let's get a little bit more detail on Nitesh. This is going to be the longest red section, not the film yet. Not the film yet. So once a day, Nitesh, who at the time of writing was in his early 30s, wakes up at 5:30 and harshly shakes his occasional roommate from his slumber. He bathes and then he leaves the lodge with which he shares with most of the flower sellers. He crosses the road to the bus station and collects bundles of flowers that his contact in Mysore has sent him. Along with his fellow sellers, he then makes his way a little bit up the street and sits in the partially covered depression in the road I mentioned before. Now, some of the sellers will not move from that spot in the morning, but Nitesh and about 10 others, depending on the day of the week, because obviously different gods, different days are more popular, they set off around different parts of the city. Some stop and sit at junctions, but others, like Nitesh, spend about the next 4 hours walking the city. Now, over the last 10 years or so, the routes belonging to the different sellers have become informally settled between one another. Each seller has developed they're all men, his own route bit by bit over the years, and they're coordinated so that one flower seller can't incur onto the route of another flower seller. Now, informal hierarchies do exist, but there's no one particular controlling individual. There are frequent arguments between the vendors, but they're mostly not about routes, but rather petty things like borrowing razors or borrowing a pair of scissors and so on. Now, in terms of route development, I'll give you a quote here from Kishore, who's a different developer. When I asked him how he selected his route, he told me, "Select means that whilst going around, I come to know. When I started, there was no business. Customers were unknown to me. But as days passed, customers became known to me. Then business was better. Like that. In the beginning, there'll be no business for anyone." However, as we saw before, if a flower seller does leave the city, another seller might temporarily take over his route. And this was actually encouraged because it kept the regular customers supplied and kept the sort of maintenance of cultivation of regularity in mind. Now, in fact, Devaraj, the guy who I tried to show around, who I mentioned in the very beginning, he route hopped for a while because he never had his own route. He was just constantly filling in for different flower sellers. And as he was doing this, he was translating what he learned and he was adding his own profitable detours to his route. And when he did do this, he was very proud of telling me, "Hey, look, I managed to make this extra money by going here," etc., and so on. Now, around 6:15 a.m., Nitesh, he drops into a canteen and then he jumps on a bus to take him a few stops in the direction of the market. But he gets down at a junction when there are a few more canteens for him to supply. He's in a rush and he appears mildly irritated when he is stopped by a friendly customer who wants to have a chat. Usually he delivers to this customer's home, but now this customer is out on his morning health walk and wants to chat, etc., and so on. So extracting himself from the pleasantries, Nitesh sways down the road towards a petrol station, balancing the basket on his head. He makes his way through the tiny streets, slowly zigzagging in the direction of the market. Now, Nitesh is one of the ones who's developed his route over 10 years. And when I asked him how he chose his particular route, he told me, with the English term, market research. Now, this consisted of him going door to door with his flowers, asking who wanted to buy them, then remembering which houses and on which days, and then following that route. And it was often not totally clear to me or to him or to the customers which came first, the desire to have flowers delivered to your house in the morning or the offer of having them. Now, in one morning, Nitesh sells around 10 kilograms of flowers, and this is significantly more by many of his fellow sellers, and he doesn't actually need to work as a stationary vendor in the night like most of his fellow sellers. As he boasted to me, "Everyone is sitting, but I'm walking. I finish early, but those who sit and sell are very slow. Mine is a fast selling. At 10 o'clock or 10:30, I'll finish everything. But these people, they'll sit till the evening, till 8 o'clock. Now, his remarks here highlight the importance of speed. Selling on the move is of course more profitable the faster a vendor walks, but profitability also increases with greater concentrations of customers. So on another occasion, when I was with a different vendor called Lokesh, now he was called down the road some distance by a customer who wanted to buy only 10 rupees worth of flowers. Now the customer asked Lokesh to come again the next day, and Lokesh said, yeah, of course I will. But then he told me straight away he wouldn't do so because it was too far out of the way and would be a waste of time for him. Back to Nitesh. So leaving the tight residential streets behind, Nitesh crosses Car Street and into the market area of the city around 7 a.m. He stops for a quick standing up breakfast of idli and samba at a roadside stall before continuing on his way. He stops again, this time to talk for 5 minutes with a family with whom he is exceptionally friendly. This always surprised me, like why he wanted to sit and chat with this family so much. Now this is a recently retired couple, and they sit in their garden after breakfast reading their English language newspapers, and they always welcome Nitesh warmly. Nitesh, who refers to them as his friends, told me that he arranged the flowers for their daughter's wedding, and that they always enjoyed talking with him about his life. Leaving them behind, his route is now a mix of businesses and houses. Now, many of the businesses are still closed at this hour because most businesses open around 9 or 10 a.m. But as per a prior agreement, Nitesh places the flowers inside plastic bags and hooks them to the metal shutters that adorn each of the business fronts. He then returns later in the day to collect his money. This, he explains proudly to me, is his smart innovation to get around the problem of needing to be in many places at once. When I first saw him do this, I asked him, did he think it was risky, because in case people do not pay, and he told me that there was trust between himself and the customers. Even some people have agreements with him to pay him weekly or sometimes even monthly. Now, of course, the vendors have to coordinate their selling with the religious rhythmic modes, including the time of the day and the time of the week. Now, I didn't introduce in the start of this presentation why people are buying flowers, because we all know buying garland of flowers not only for the hair, but more likely for puja in the morning. Now, of course, as you know, like different days of the week are associated with different gods, and so this means that the use of garlands of flowers for daily puja has two important rhythmic consequences for the sellers. The first is that more flowers are sold on certain days of the week, and that flowers are needed at certain times of the day. So the busiest days are Thursday and Friday because of Lakshmi, and the ideal state for garlanding is one of cleanliness. So you have to deliver in the morning before or just after the bath, and to the shop. Then you have to deliver just after it's been swept. So like Nitesh has to deliver, at these times. And on the house, it's fairly easy because people are busy doing their own things, and he can do that before people bath. But in the shops, this is why he has to use his plastic bags. Now the sun is up about 9 a.m, already making Nitesh sweat as he enters the market grounds proper. Now he's one of hundreds of people moving around with goods on their heads. He picks his way through the crossing coconut, fruit and vegetable loaders and enters an indoor trading centre where merchants from both North and South India run electrical appliance, retail and wholesale businesses. Here, nearly all of his customers are men, and they have very banter-heavy interactions, mainly based around Nitesh's proudly announced high level of education and yet seemingly lowly job. The complex is a swirl of LED lights, joking calls, brushes swatting away dust and shutters being screeched open as Nitesh leaves the building and crosses the path of the female vegetable head loaders I mentioned before and into the covered central fruit and vegetable market. Now here he meets a row of middle-aged local ladies who sit together threading flowers with their baskets of their completed wares in front of them. Upon seeing Nitesh, they inquire about buying some of his flowers to sell themselves. When he gives them a price, they berate him for being dishonest, for being sneaky and for being a drinker. When he argues back, they threaten to slap him. And then they do in the end buy some of his flowers like they do almost every single day. Now, Nitesh and other migrant sellers, they moved into the city to take over from local moving female sellers about 10 years ago. Many of the local women, most but not all were Catholics, they were so successful in going door to door with their flowers that they could afford to send their kids to college. And of course, when their kids going through college, they were like, I'm not going to be selling flowers in the street, I want an office job. And it's sort of the space opened up within the market. Now, Mangalore, as I mentioned, has a lot of education institutes, and in general, sort of the level of education in Mangalore is high for Karnataka and for India. And now it's not to say that Mangaloreans don't do sort of dirty or unprestigious street work. It's just that for the most part they don't do it in Mangalore, they do it in Dubai. And when they come back to Mangalore, then they open a shop and then they want to all be in an office. Now, the local women who were selling the flowers before, they had quite a different relationship with their customers than Nitesh. Now, part of this is because they're outsiders, and part of this is because they're from a rural background, and also part of it, of course, is to do with jati, for them being supposedly low caste. Now, even some people, some Brahmin former customers of these sellers would tell me that they don't buy their flowers because they found them dirty, and they found these people dirty. Now, around 10:30 a.m., Nitesh is already heading back towards the bus station when he meets up with other sellers. The walkers all return around the same time. If they have some leftover flowers that they didn't sell during their morning route, they might sit for a while and compete against the more permanent stationary vendors for some passing trade before packing up around 11 a.m. The sun is now really beating down hard. If you've been to Mangalore, it's always hot, and it always makes you sweat. And the vendors usually then have a quick drink of beer or whiskey in one of the wine shops that are opposite the bus station before eating and then heading upstairs to rest. They all gather in a room with a television and they watch a comedy or music channel for a while before drifting off to sleep, usually 3 or 4 to a bed. Waking in the afternoon, Nitesh refreshes himself, has a snack in one of the canteens and slopes up the road to sit with those vendors who sell in the evening too. Each of the vendors has 1 to 3 baskets of different garlands of flowers and sometimes a bucket of roses. The sellers stretch out their garlands for potential customers to see. They measure them against their arms. It's 10 rupees and 30 rupees. And as you can see the length of my arms, I can never be a flower seller because I would never make any money as they used to. It's important to know, right? Important to know this. And of course, now customers come, they slow down, and they often argue then with the flower sellers. They're often always being told that their arms were crooked, that they weren't, and that they weren't stretching out their arms long enough, etc. and so on. Now, sometimes they get a couple of extra inches or centimeters if they manage to negotiate successfully with the flower seller about whether or not their arm was straight or crooked. Now, after the lifespan, the lifespan of the flowers is important here because depending on the type of flower and the weather, this sort of changes the way the flower has to be sold. And then we think more about the synchrony between the flower seller's lives and the actual flower itself. So the flowers, they've been threaded, remember, they've traveled across the state and they've been stored in a lodge. So the customer might get the choice of cheaper flowers because they're on the last legs, they might only last 1 more day. The customers might believe the flowers are fresher than what they are because they've been sprinkled with water, or the customer might get no choice at all and they're sort of confused and the flowers are shoved into a bag and passed up. Now Nitesh spends some time with the sellers, some time engaged in time pass around the bus station, and some time in the wine shop until around 9 p.m. when all the flower sellers sort of stop. The vendors then join Nitesh for drinks, either in the wine shops or with bottles sneaked into the lodge to be drunk alongside biryani or some other meat dish. Then they drink, they eat, they watch television, and they bicker, tease, joke, laugh, play, and fight like any other group of men anywhere in the world who are away from their families before falling asleep around 11 p.m. Now I show the video. So I'm going to show a video of flower sellers, and it's very important to say 2 things. First is that the flower sellers who I'm showing in the video, none of them. Any corrections, etc. and so on, it sort of ends abruptly. And the final last thing to say is, I got to the subtitling about 90% of the way through, so if you don't speak Kannada, then you should learn.
ಇಷ್ಟು ಎಷ್ಟಾಗ್ನಿ 30 ಮಾರಿ ಮೂರು 100 ರೂಪಾಯಿ ಕೊಡ್ತೇನೆ 3.5 105 ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಣ್ಣ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಮುಂಡದ ಮುಗಿತೆಲ್ಲ ಕರ್ಗೋ ಓಲ ಬೆಳಗಲೆ ಓಲ ಓಲ ಧರ್ಮ ಇದ್ರೆ ದೇವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಈಗ ಬಂದಿರೋದನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿ ಈಗ ಬಿಡ್ತಾರದು ಇಂಥ ಪ್ರೆಸ್ಸು ಎಲ್ಲೂ ಸಿಕ್ಕಲ್ಲ ಆಟ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊ ಮೂವತ್ತು ಅನಿಸಿದೆ ನನಗನಿಸಿದೆ ನಿನ್ನೆ. ಹಾಂ ಮಲ್ಲಿಗ ಮಲ್ಲಿಗ ಓಯ್ ಮಲ್ಲಿಗ ಓಯ್ 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 ಬೇಕಾ? ತಾಳೆ
ನೀವು ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ರು ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ ನಿನ್ನ ರಾತ್ರಿ ಬಂದ ಆ ಕಡೆ ನೀವು ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ
ರಾತ್ರಿ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ಹಾಂ ನೆನ್ನೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಿತ್ತು ಅವ್ರು. ನೆನ್ನೆ ಹೂಕಲ್ಲ ಇತ್ತು, ಮ್ಯಾಚ್ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದು. IPL
ಮ್ಯಾಚಿಂದಾಗಿ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಊಸ ಇಲ್ಲ ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ.
ನೆನ್ನೆ ಗೆಲೆ ಮ್ಯಾಚ್ ಸೋತ್ರ ಪಂಜಾಬು 1 ಬಾಲ್ಗೆ, ಅದು ವಿಕೆಟ್ ಹೊಂಟ ಹೊಡ್ತು. ಒಡೆಯ ಮ್ಯಾಚ್ 1 ಬಾಲ್ಗೆ 5 ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು, ಸೋತ್ರಲ್ಲ. ಸರಿ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಣ್ಣ. KSRTC ಮುಂಚೆ ಮಂಗಳೂರು ಊಟಗಳಿ ಮೈಸೂರು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ವ್ಯಾಪಾರ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದು. ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು ಮಂಗಳೂರಿಗೆ. ಈಗ ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಉಂಟಲ್ಲ. ಸಾಕಿಲ್ಲ.
ಎಷ್ಟಕ್ಕ? 2 ಮೊಳ 10 ರೂಪಾಯಿ.
ಮೊದಲೇ 100 ರೂಪಾಯಿ.
idea of a day in the life in the flower cellars. And now in the very final section, I want to abstract up what we've learned, or what I hope we've learned, like from talking about these more ethnographic elements to sort of abstract this up. But first, I'll find a little bit of ethnography with Natesh. Now, around once a year, Natesh and the other flower sellers return back to their Oru, their native place near Mysuru for the village's annual Jatri. Is Jatri a pan-Indian word or not? Anyway, this procession festival that happens. And they tell their customers in advance, and their absence seems to be generally accepted by everyone. I mean, it's a legitimate reason to go home for your Jatri. Now, possibly brought forth by the intense time spent at home with their families, or maybe the break from their usual routine, or my presence with them in their home, the sellers were particularly reflective about their lives and their aspirations in the moments of calm during the festival. Now, this was especially the case for Natesh. Now, Natesh had actually disappeared from Mangalore about 1 month before the festival, and his phone number had stopped working, and people on his route were complaining that he'd basically given up. So because of this, I'd not seen him for quite some time, when on the morning of the festival, at another flower seller's house, I woke up and found him staring at me, sitting in the bedroom. Now, we soon went off together, and he showed me around his village. The school he went to, the dried up stone-stepped water tank, the wine shop, and of course we had to go to the wine shop because he told me then his hands shake if he doesn't drink. And after the whiskey, he told me he'd been drinking for around 10 years, and he's very upset at himself for doing it. He feels that he's failed himself, and he feels also that he's failed his wife and his daughter. Now, Natesh is very interesting. He's very sort of exceptional in a way. I said he wasn't exceptional before, didn't I? So I'm contradicting myself. But he's exceptional in a way amongst the flower sellers because he has a bachelor degree from the University of Mysore in humanities. And after he got his degree, he started to work for an NGO. And then soon after starting work for the NGO, he fell in love with a girl from a nearby village, and they got married. Now, in his own understanding, it was around then that he started to develop a problem with drink. And this made the NGO job difficult, and he started to sell flowers like other from his village to make ends meet. And this allowed him to work in the morning and then drink in the afternoon and evening. Now, after a short time spent in Madikeri, and then he went on and moved to work in Mangalore. Now, as we walked in the village on the day of the Jatri, I asked him about his plans for the future, but he became very elusive and a little morose. He said his daughter is sick, he says, the hospital bills are expensive, and so he has to sell flowers. However, much to the annoyance of his fellow sellers, he believes he is a little bit above his job. He is not only literate, or most of them are illiterate, but he's also highly educated. Now, when we walked his route together in Mangalore, he used to like to point out all the different differences in between different groups in the city and explain them to me. And this is something that I really appreciated. It was like having a street-level sociologist with me as I walked around the city. He would point out like the sellers of cheap plastic goods who come from North India and explain how he was richer than them and his friends were richer than them. And then he pointed to the local fish sellers and explained how I could tell from their clothes that they were much richer than him and his friends, and so on. Now, when we were in the village during his festival, he continued this practice, and we started to walk around. He started to explain things to give me information for my article, as he called it. So he explained the temple, the procession, the idol, the eating of chickens, the type of snacks, and so on. And at one point, we passed a man who has no legs, and he was begging for money. And Natesh pointed at him and said, "This is a poor man." And there's two men standing behind us, and he said, and one of them laughed and said, "What about you? You're not poor?" And he just turned to them and smiled. Now, this is the last we're going to have of Natesh, and now finally I really do want to abstract a little bit and start to think a little bit about what their selling does. Now, as we saw, the repeated selling of relations, they go beyond that just of a consumer and a seller, and they cross sort of jati, age, gender, and many different groups. So we observe, middle-class Anglophones forging friendships, or parents offering invitations for their children's wedding, and so on. Now, regularity also forms a type of loyalty. For example, we saw at the start how Devaraj struggled to take over Natesh's route, and so on. But as selling repeats year on year and day by day, it changes and also deepens relations. But this is sort of a bit of an obvious thing to say. So in this final section, beyond this, I want to argue that regularity, so the repetition in itself, this changes to some degree vendors' place in the city. Now, I'm going to argue that vendors manage to carve out a type of normalcy, a normalness with their regularities, and they somehow ethically assert their belonging in the city through their use of, or not their use, through anticipation. Now, recall the argument I made in the beginning about cities. We can think of cities as a bundle of different rhythms or different rhythmic patterns or modes. They're variously synchronized, coherent, and they have common or different directions. Now, with this in mind, let's think through the regularities of these vendors. And I think this is a very important ethical dimension. Now, it's important to say that the vendors themselves don't frame their act as being something necessarily ethical. They walk the city to sell their goods. Yet, nevertheless, there's a strong ethical dimension to it. Now, they're, of course, the actor of the market sphere, but there's always a crossover between the market sphere and the ethical sphere. I mean, anthropologists, and I'm an anthropologist, they've long looked into how systems of exchange have important repercussions for sociality, with questions of virtue and morality always flowing through such systems. Now, I'm following here an anthropologist called Lambeck, and he has this idea called a performative act, an act which exemplifies the way a certain sociality works. Now, in his understanding, ethics are intrinsic to even everyday, ordinary acts. Now, ethics or morality doesn't just exist in great acts of heroism or in political performance, but, and they're not really also representative of something else, but rather such acts are constitutive of society itself. Now, importantly, performative ethical acts, they not only respond to criteria, but they can generate criteria themselves. So, for example, the appreciation of regularity is created by that same regularity itself, if that makes sense. No? So, people say, okay, it's good that this flower seller is regular, but the idea of him even being regular was only created because the flower seller was first regular. Now, if we start to look at this, we can see in the ways in which vendors begin to release themselves, at least a little bit, from the dependency that they have on their customers' rhythmic patterns. Now, importantly, I think such performative acts like being regular, they have a value not only in terms of their ends, i.e. sort of what is done or the economic value, but they also contain a value in their very doing. So it's not just the fact that they're selling, but this regularity in itself has a certain ethical dimension. Now, that is to say, the skilled ability to be in the same place at the same time has a value that is not necessarily dependent upon the thing sold. Now, if you want to think about this, you might want to think about this in your own workplace. There's an ethical performance to coming into work early. There's an ethical performance to staying at work late. Not necessarily what you do in the workplace. You might be on the third floor playing table tennis all day, but not you. But nevertheless, you perform this sort of, I'm a hard worker, and or a good worker, from through this sort of rhythmic, regular act. Now, of course, the activity cannot be completely divorced from the outcome. Now, we know this, of course, with certain things that are sold. We know that, what is sold is often bound up with the category of the seller in India. So in Mangalore, all of the cobblers are Dalits who speak Tamil from northern Karnataka, because for many so-called caste Hindus, they self-preclude themselves from such work. Now, what does this regular repetition do? Now, in one sense, I think if you act in the same way often enough, it creates a sort of sense of deep reliability or sort of temporal depth. But this isn't sort of like a machine-like mechanical repetition, because very often the sellers are remembering little things at the same time. It's not only that they turn up at your door every day, but they remember something. They ask about your daughter, or they say, I'm giving you the best goods because we're friends, and so on. This is something that Veena Das has called the detection of the human within the machine. It's like sort of you're doing something repetitive, but at the same time you're constantly, reminding the person that they're a human, or that you're a human, and that you have something there. So it's repetition with difference, it's change and sameness mixed in together. So, for example, there was a fruit seller from northern Karnataka. He was a relative of one of these cobblers I mentioned, and he would always try to identify or remember the different languages he should use to speak to people. Mangalore is a city where there's many different languages. So Beris, who are Beri Muslim group, speak Beri Bhashe, and then Catholics and Gauda Sarasat Brahmins all speak Konkani, and he would always at least be able to do the little bits of selling in their local language. Now, as I mentioned, sort of regularity induces a certain temporal depth. But this temporal depth doesn't just exist in the past, but it also exists in the future. Now, when I used to ask people, first about the past, when I used to ask people, I knew from the vendors how long they'd been doing a certain route. Then I go to the same customers and I'd ask, so how long have these vendors been doing the same route? They would never really remember. Sometimes it might have been 2 years. They're like, this guy's been there for ages, 5, 6 years or something like this. And this is how repetition works. If you do start to do things, we start to do rituals, and we start to think, okay, we lose. It makes it blurred in the past. But it also makes it blurred in the past, but it also changes our relationship to the future. So as I said before, I'm thinking about the city as a type of rhythm or rhythmic modes, and they of course draw on past patterns, but they also always suggest future patterns. You know, each rhythmic moment, each sort of, if you want to think about a clap, each clap is a confirmation of a beat, but it's also an anticipation of a future beat. This sort of twists the idea of who it is who's setting the beat, who's the person who's setting the beat for somebody else's rhythm. Now, I'm going to abstract a little bit more, but I think it's a really interesting idea from an ethnomethodologist called Garfinkel, and he explored the idea about people clapping along to a metronome. Now, if you think about yourself having to clap along to a metronome, now, if you were following the metronome, then you would be out of time because you'd always be just behind it. So you have to start to anticipate the metronome and how it comes. So if actually you're clapping in time to a metronome, you'll be masking the beat of a metronome. Now imagine watching this on a video and you didn't know any of the setup before, and you didn't know what a metronome did. You start to ask yourself the question, who is it who's following who? What's the relationship between the two? You know, when the clapping is in time, is the clapper following the metronome or not? Now, so of course they embody the beat in sort of anticipation in a way, they're not following it. I hope that's clear. So if we turn here to think about the sort of the way, the place where the sellers sell, I framed the street before as a place of political contestation, you know, and now moving vendors there with their regular routes, they somehow mask themselves in the rhythmic modes of the city by following their customers' routes. They make themselves silent or invisible in a way, and they slip them between being noticed and being ignored. That's why they're walking at the same time in the same place every day, and then they have to call out themselves for the goods. Hue, malage, hue, as they're walking around. So as they walk in time to their customers in the wider city's metronomic schedules, they avoid being labeled as a nuisance within certain classed ideas of what a modern city should be or should be free from. And this is why, of course, they have to call out. Now, masking the rhythmic modes of another in the city does not necessarily entail dependency. As I mentioned, if you imagine the video, you'll be unsure who came. This is sort of like clapping in time isn't just a marking of time, it's also a making of time. You know, it's like a prospective production of a socially coherent time, sort of a movement. You know, a clapper is not only clapping along to a metronome, he's in a relationship with the metronome, or she's in a relationship with the metronome. They're also sort of forging out in their own sort of clapping pattern. Now you start to ask yourself a question that I mentioned before in the Tesha's route, like what came first, you know, the chicken or the egg, the desire to have the flowers regularly, or then the flower seller then delivering them. Now the flower sellers become, once you have a set route, he becomes in a much more powerful position. He doesn't necessarily need those particular individual customers because he's got a whole array of different rhythmic relationships which he has with people about the city. So in the end then the flower seller is the one who started to set the beat within which others can follow. So performative regular acts then, even as they follow contextually defined rules, they continually reproduce new and divergent rhythmic patterns. They're following previous rhythms, but they're also making new rhythms. So the regular rhythmic modes of the vendors are not only markers of somebody else's rhythm, but they're makers of time and space, and as such they're makers of the cityscape itself, not only in the past, but also in the future. So to conclude, finally, I'll read this. With a city whose elite social imaginary is one of smooth flow, friction-free consumption, and accelerated progress, these anticipation-induced, embodied, virtuous, and sociability engendering regular performative acts transform the vendor's place in the city. This is not an explicit verbal articulation of a claim of the right to the city, as is the case with the work of vendors' organisations like the National Association of Street Vendors of India, but rather it's a rhythmical entanglement through and with the cityscape. So as the vendors undergo their daily selling, rhythmically inhabiting the city, their novel practices slide into always have been. And anticipation is key here because everyday expectation reorientates the vendor's position within the city. They've gone from being a symbol of metropolitan space out of control to becoming a normal part of the morning routine. Vendors, in learning the complex rhythmic modes of the city, move through repeated routines over many years from being marginal to becoming anticipated. It is through their virtuous embodied regularities that vendors weave their way into the stream of the city. Thank you.
Time for questions or comments.
Okay, so thank you. It was fascinating. I wanted to ask you about the dominant beat. And after all that, why would you call the dominant beat as being separate from this?
I don't think the dominant beat is separate from it. I think, did I say it was separate?
No, you didn't, but I waited till the end to see where you placed it. So it was, you're juxtaposing their perceived role with what their actual role is. So how is the dominant arrived at? Maybe you can just answer that.
So I think if you think the dominant beat, like who is it who's powerfully setting what the city should be? Now, so a lot of it is the middle class in urban India right now. These are the people who are sort of defining in many different ways in the public sphere through this sort of participatory governance, for being involved in certain relationships with people in the state, from people who are demanding certain shopping malls being built, etc. and so on. These are the people who are setting the dominant beat, at least discursively. These are the people setting the dominant beat in the Indian city. But this is not a hegemonic thing, This is, it's dominance without I can never say that word. Hemogen. Yes, to rephrase an old thing. So I mean, this is why there's always space for negotiation. This is why there's always space for flower sellers or other moving vendors or other people in the city to find their own ways within any sort of dominant beat. If that answers? Partially.
So thanks, firstly, very interesting. But I have since especially you ended on sort of that note of differentiating it from Nasvi's work and making the, you started with Lefebvre and then have this sort of thing between saying it's not a right to the city mode necessarily. So in part, I'm sort of like questioning that, because Lefebvre talks both about the everyday and about the right to the city frame. So there's a little bit of that kind of that tension between those two framings. The second is then what what you call the rhythmic entanglement of them being part of what city's everyday life is. What do you see as the what do you see as the political project in there? Is there a political project, or is this a sort of I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of leaving that question open.
For me or for the flower sellers?
In your abstract, in the abstraction that you're doing out of your research, that do you see this modality of everyday, this rhythm, being tied into a larger political project of the urban in any way? Because the right to the city has been framed in that sort of a way, that in terms of like, by stating it in that form, you're making it very clear about all the invisibles and all of the sort of uncounted to become a part of the political project of what it is to be part of the urban. But now that you're reframing it as more of a rhythmic entanglement, do you see that political project being reinterpreted? My question is not very clear.
So I'll try to answer it. So to start with the second point, I would say that what you can learn politically from looking at a city rhythmically, as opposed to looking at it as a space. Now, very often, like in protest movements and etc. and so on, it's always been about claiming a central part of the city or stopping it. But I think what actually disrupts the dominant part of a city or the dominant beat of a city more is to do something temporary. Like when people block streets, that's not necessarily, okay, it's a claim on space, but it's also a claim on rhythm. It's also a claim of saying, listen, we're going to disrupt this rhythm of the city. So I think you can learn a lot from looking at a city rhythmically, from looking at the sort of everyday modalities of people like hawkers, to try and really understand this sort of how tightly wound together all these different parts of the city are, and how you want to, if you want to start to disrupt things, how you could possibly disrupt things. So I think politically, it's there. Now, I'm not saying, the reason why I frame this, I'm not saying this is not, I'm not framing this against necessarily this right to the city thing, but simply I'm saying that they are making a claim of the right to the city, but they're not articulating this claim. And this isn't a claim necessarily, okay, it's not, they're not making a claim, rather a claim is being made through their actions, we can say. So it's like it's more like an ethical assertion rather than something strictly political, and not something which is framed as political.
Oh, sure.
I was terribly late for the talk, but the thing that drove me here is this question of, you use a very beautiful word, anticipation, and do you derive or do you borrow this word, or is it coming from this whole concept of l'avenir as discussed by perhaps Derrida? Is that a stream of influence at all?
No, the influence to think about anticipation comes from two places. Firstly, is this sort of is a French-Hungarian philosopher called Abrahams, who has this beautiful book about anticipation and rhythm in poetry. But he also talked about riding on trains, etc., and so on. And the translation's from 1995, I think. But it also draws into this sort of wider discourses which have been existing in anthropology for some time. The work of James Ferguson, and more recently the work of Jamie Cross, who works in India, thinking about James Ferguson's idea. He does work in the copper belt in Zambia, and he looks at expectation of modernity, not necessarily anticipation. He's talking about expectation and what this expectation of modernity does. And Cross works in special economic zones in Andhra Pradesh, and he calls these dream zones. He calls those places how they're all about expectation, or all about anticipation, about the economy of anticipation, as it were. This is what drives a lot of things in India. So I think it's more of from this material sort of point of view, from this sort of anthropology, and to think about it poetically as well. So yeah, I'm not clever enough to understand Derrida.
Okay. So you spoke about society, and you spoke about cities and anticipation. So is it not the scope of an anthropologist to take it further to human nature?
Culture.
So this, you talk about anticipation at the scale of society for modernity.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're dealing with here, or finding out or representing, or that's what I'm getting, is anticipation on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And what reaffirms at a societal level is what happens on a daily basis at the level of each human being.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't get into that much. Or
You mean like something broader to say about what expectation or anticipation does, more broadly for humankind?
or how this fits in, why whatever is being called dominant will not be dominant, because at the level of human interaction there is anticipation and expectation and emergence almost. So this regularity is in response to not just a societal need but a human individual need.
Yeah, I mean, regularity can be extremely comforting, right? And this is, and I think this is an important thing to point out, is that very often I think what's framed, things that are repeated, people often frame this as being something machine-like, or being something boring, or being something grinding. Now, if you look at people who live in war zones, like very often one of the things that makes breakdown happen, like psychological trauma for people, is this lack of regularity, this lack of routine. Like routine and regularity, we are creatures of routine and regularity. We like to make ourselves regular. It has certainly a certain function, if you like, not only for sociality, but also I think for your physical well-being as well. No, like you have to eat at the same time, sleep at the same time, etc., and so on. So I think regularity is something really important to look at. And to get away from this idea that, modernity creates these boring, repetitive type things. Repetition has always been there in human society. We love to make, rituals. We love to make, to organize our lives around, different cycles, whether it be harvests or whether it be, the sun going around the earth or the earth going around the sun.
So the next question that comes from that is, did you walk with the flower seller or be with him during festivals?
Yeah, I went back to his village during the Jatri, during the procession, and yeah. So I mean, this is part of the reason why you need, I think, sort of long-term ethnographic engagement with people to really understand their lives in the city. Because if you take just a snapshot of just, go and speak to people for 1 week or for 1 day, you get a real temporal thing like this. And of course, you're always constrained, by your own life and by money and so on, how long you can spend with people. But I was in the city for around 2 stints of 9 months, and then with a short break in the middle. So I met Natesh, I think, in January, so I knew him over 1.5 years, like with a break in the middle. And so this is exactly how you get this thing. So if I'd just gone around with him once, I would have said, wow, what an amazing guy who has everything really balanced in his life. He can sell this and so on. Then you hang out with him for a year, you realize, okay, he has a drink problem, he has problems at home, and like everything sort of falls to pieces. And this is what's interesting, I think, of doing participatory observation as an anthropologist, because then you get to see the difference between what people say and what people do, and to try and understand it like this. Did I answer? No, stop. I'm speaking really fast, no?
So important, and repetition is really what defines the way they go about the business. How, to what extent would they go to keep this up? Do they take cuts in profit? Are they okay with, to just keep this going? And do they have backup plans? Do they get paranoid that, this, if something breaks, they don't have a backup plan? Do they?
So it's a really good question. So like they would often tell me, like the guys who were there every single day, that this was really set, this was really strict, etc. and so on. But then once when the flower prices went really high, they just stopped doing it. And then because it wasn't profitable for them to sell anymore. Because people, like the customers wouldn't buy the flowers for more than 10 rupees, 30 rupees for malagate, for jasmine, with different prices for different flowers. So even though that they create this idea of thing being very much strict, etc. and so on, often this breaks down. And the way I would think about this is that, okay, if someone just does something once and then stops, then it's forgotten. But if you've been building up a relationship with people over many years, and then you go back for a festival, or you can't sell because there's a problem with goods, etc. and so on, then it becomes more acceptable for the customers that they're in a relationship with. So the regular repetition has built certain relationships which allow deviance or to come from that. Mm-hmm.
In a way, they are paying a price to keep up the rhythm.
Yeah, sometimes they have to, and like sometimes, sometimes this relationship that's built is important. I mean, sometimes not, right? You saw in the video, and like when he's in the mobile phone shop, and he said to the guy, "Oh yeah, I didn't sell last night because I was watching the cricket." Yeah, and like so, and he could tell this to two young guys, they're joking, etc. like this, and he wouldn't necessarily say that same thing, to a middle-aged, middle-class housewife. He might then say, "Oh, I had to, I was sick," or yeah, exactly like this. So yeah, so I mean, I don't want to paint a picture that they're like they're super efficient doing everything like this, but rather to think about what being regular allows them then also to create deviance from this. Deviance, I don't know why I got that word, to create difference. Nope. I mean, I did research with lots of other vendors, and so we've mainly also with coconut sellers, tender coconut sellers, and fish sellers, to try and think about what the goods actually do. So like if you think about a coconut, it's not so much a temporal dimension to it, it's rather just the size. You have to store it somewhere in the evening, and they had nowhere to store it, so you have to sell all your coconuts like on the day, like, oh, that's it, And then with fish, especially when it's hot in summer, you have to sell fish really, really fast. So that's why a lot of fish sellers started to move to selling on motorbikes, even though they used to sell on foot, because then you could sell more fish and you could sell it faster, and then you could have you'd have to have like a friend with a refrigerator or a freezer somewhere in the city that you could stop and dump them in and then pick them up again later in the day, etc. and so on. And this also has and comparatively, I used to think about what the different hawkers or vendors menaces were, and you saw like with flower sellers, it's dogs. Something about dogs and flowers, the dogs always come to the flowers. With the fish sellers, it's cats, because the cats always run around. And with the coconut sellers, it's cows, because if a cow blocks these narrow roads and you can't get past, then you can't move a cow. And I didn't know where to go with this. But it would be interesting, of course, to look at this also comparatively with other cities, because Mangalore is very specific in terms of the fact is that it's mostly migrant vendors apart from fish, because fish is very profitable, because Mangaloreans don't like to do sort of outdoor work, because they, like I said, they do it in the Gulf. But, and also the terrain as well, because Mangalore is an extremely hilly city, which sort of precludes coconut sellers from going in most parts of the city, or also like these pushing vendors, the fruit and vendors, they also don't go to most parts of the city because it's just up and down like that. But again, to go back to the idea of doing like participatory deep research, it wouldn't have been impossible to do that comparatively unless I spent like 18 months in one city, 18 months in the next city, or or so on like this. And I would have loved to do that, but yeah, it's just not possible. Finance-wise.
Mangalore is the border city of Karnataka. So there will be people coming from other states too. I mean, did they have conflicts or did they have vendors from other states too?
Yeah. So this is like all the coconut sellers are from Tamil Nadu, from villages around Salem, and some from the very bottom as well. And even though they used to, and they came about 17, 18 years ago, or now about 20 years ago, they started coming to Mangalore. And like this is often the thing, obviously, with rural urban migration. One guy comes first, and then he tells somebody else back in that village, etc., and so on, and then a certain change started. So and then from like the guys who sell and the women who sell like these cheap plastic goods or blow up things or things for your car, they were nearly always from North India or candy floss. And I can't speak Hindi, I can only speak Kannada, so I couldn't speak to them so much. So I just used to like try and interact with it. It's got a really nice beach. No, but no, sorry, no.
That's more of a Mysore based or South Karnataka based, and not something that's very native to Mangalore or the coastal belt. So why not Mysore or any other place where it's actually grown and then it's more popular? Why just Mangalore?
Firstly, there are like lots of flowers grown north of Mangalore, like around Udupi, and but these flower sellers, they don't sell. They sell their own flowers from. They sell flowers from either Mysore or from Tamil Nadu, mostly the flowers that come through. And these local flowers are sold on the markets. And there was an interesting. We were talking about this at lunch the other day. There's an interesting thing: grown mostly by Catholics, sold by Muslim men, and brought by Hindus. There's a nice triangle. And but why did I choose Mangalore? Like broadly, I was interested in small city or smaller city urbanization, because like nearly always when people start to look at cities in India and actually everywhere, they always go to the same metropolises. Like they always go there, and I think if urban theory keeps like only looking at Mumbai, New York, and London or Tokyo, then they're only going to get certain answers to certain questions because they're only framing themselves within metropolises. Now, I said, okay, I should pick a city, and I wasn't only interested in looking at flower sellers, I also did research with auto rickshaw drivers and also with housing and land brokers. So I said, okay, I want a city of around 500,000. I just chose that number like this in a way, because like it's really hard to try and pick a smaller city to do research in India and anywhere else, because there's hardly anything written about it, So I really just said, okay, it's on the coast, that could be fun. And I'm thinking about rhythm, and you've got the rhythm of trade because you've got all these different things. And also when I looked at Mangalore, I saw like what then I would conceive of as signs of tension within the city of its rapid growth. I'm talking about like the Hindutva, like moral policemen who are going around, beating up college students, etc., and so on. So I said, okay, yeah, why not go to Mangalore? But I could have really chosen anywhere. And that's like a shame, I guess, of urban research at the moment. And I wish more and more people would go and research other places, and not Mumbai. There's an amazing tendency, especially like with white British researchers, to go to the same slum in Mumbai and to write stories of poverty, And I find it really deeply uncomfortable. This sort of like, it's almost like a poverty porn in a way, And like, okay, of course you fly into Mumbai and you see this massive slum, and it's a fascination, but it's almost an orientalizing fascination with it. So I said, okay, like cities in India, they're not only about poverty, and this is really important, I think, especially in the West, because this is like the image that we have, Indian cities are poor and everyone lives in slums, etc., and so on. So let's pick a city that doesn't fit that mold. Like Mangalore hardly has any slums at all, like nothing that you would call a slum, like from coming from somewhere else. Has a highly literate, educated populace. It has all these different things going on, not just like IT and BPO, but like a big port and a special economic zone. So yeah, why not let's try and understand like urbanity or urbanism from somewhere like that.
All right, if there aren't any more questions, we'll wrap it up now. Thank you, Yin, for coming and presenting your work.
Thanks a lot. It needs to be. Yeah, I have a new project with that in mind. I want to make an interactive website with different rhythms of the city and flowing flowers.
Right, I just want to just point out that we have a sign-up sheet over here, and if you guys are interested, please do sign up, and we'll keep you informed of any upcoming events. As usual, please do visit our social media outlets and our website for any information. Thanks.